At the end of last year, I did a talk about the future of games from a business standpoint. I think it's always interesting to kind of talk about the future. So yeah, I thought I'd record that talk and share it here. So in the last 10 years, obviously, well, not the last 10 years, in fact, I'm going to talk about games from 1999, it's a long time ago. So I think over time, the video games industry has changed an awful lot. And it only stands to reason to imagine that it's going to change an awful lot in the future as well. It's not going to stay the same. It's a massively, all technology industries change so much, right? So unless we think about the future, we're not going to be ready for it. So that's kind of why we're talking about it here. I started making games in 1999 because I'm really old. And back then, if we look at the way the industry was, what you did was you built a game with your company, and then you sent that game to a publisher who then spent hundreds of thousands of dollars manufacturing cartridges and storing those cartridges in warehouses and putting those cartridges into trucks that were then driven to the stores. And those stores were basically sold into by a huge force of people who would like phone up on the telephone and say, buy our stuff, right? So the amount of people involved in actually getting your product from your computer into the hands of consumers is massive, right? So then it was impossible for developers to make their own games and distribute them. There was a very tiny digital market, so it was all about physical. And people were quite happy, you know, that's the way it was. So what was interesting was that there was less competition. So some of the things that we worked on weren't necessarily great, like Rock'em Sock'em Robots, that's here on this slide, which is the worst rated Game Boy Advance game of all time. But what's interesting about that game is that it basically, you know, I worked on it and it was crap, but it still got, I still saw it in like Toys R Us, I still saw it like in all the local stores, and I still saw it even when I moved to Singapore. I found it in a shop for sale. So a really, really shitty game like that, the worst rated game of all time on that platform, still managed to sell, right? Still managed to make its way across the world, still got in people's eyes, right? And so nowadays, obviously, you know, that's incredible. We don't have that, but that was because there was so little competition. And at the time we thought there was loads, but you know, there was like, oh my god, there's 2 games coming out this week. Oh shit, what's going to happen? You know. So obviously what happened was that digital appeared, and digital's an incredible thing because suddenly I can make a game and I can release it and it goes straight into the hands of the consumer, and there's none of that like middleman stuff apart from Steam taking their 30% or whoever it is, right? The guy who has a hard drive, and it seems like, oh my god, so painful he takes 30%, but compared to what we had to do before, it's not painful at all. It's fantastic, right? It's liberating. It's changed the world. So, the world for games, anyway. Obviously, what does that mean? That meant that there was a huge flood of video game developers. So, you know, from students to professionals to hobbyists, everybody could now make a game. Tools are there, the skills are there. You know, suddenly we've got millions of games out, which is a great thing because more games means more fun. But it's not a great thing for everyone. It's not a great thing for us, for example, because now there's like 1 million games on the market, you know, 10,000 games coming out a week on iOS or whatever. Like, how do you get recognized? So this is like a Steam thing, but like, obviously mobile is famous for being like the hardest platform in the world to get discovered on. There's something like 10,000 games coming out a week or a month or something on mobile right now. So how do people find your game? It's crazy. So what does that mean? How did that change, right? So when mobile first appeared, obviously there weren't so many games, but people still wanted to like be adopted like by the mass market. So when the first person in the world made their game free and they saw lots of downloads, people thought, wow, free is a way to cut through the noise. If I make my game free, I'll get lots of downloads. So that was the initial shift, right? It's a way to get noticed. You make it free to get noticed and get people playing your game. The fact is, if 1 million people download your game and you make only a tiny fraction of money from each one, you're still going to make more money than if you release a game and nobody downloads it because it's $2 and they can't be bothered to spend $2. Obviously, the business model is that everyone has a phone, and if you can get a huge percentage of people to play your game, then even if a tiny percent of that huge percent will give you some money, then you can make a lot of money, right? So that basically resulted in a race to the bottom, and then a race in like how we squeeze money out of people. That's a whole different thing, right? So what happens when that happens, right? You basically, you're swamped by so much content, you can't be seen anymore. So there's 1 million free games, 10,000 a week, I need to be seen, my game. So if I'm an independent developer, I look to places where I can compete on an easier standing, more level standing. So I'd look to small blue ocean platforms where there's not much else to compete with. So if there's a storefront and there's only 50 games on it, then those people that go to that storefront have got a good chance of seeing my game. So independent developers look for new ways to sell and distribute their games. So some of these platforms, obviously PlayStation isn't really so small anymore, it's massive, but when it started it felt like a new opportunity. And you saw a lot of developers leaving mobile and moving into console and PC, moving back to where they came from. Another example of this would be live streaming. So live streaming is another new place that you can distribute your stuff, and potentially there's not many other people doing it. You're going to get a lot of store frontage, and you're going to make that revenue back. It's a tiny amount of revenue, but you're going to get more revenue. And for an independent developer, revenue is what it's all about. But streaming, streaming terrifies me, and this is why. So I think that the music industry, which is what I used to be in, that's me holding a guitar, the music industry was basically a precursor to the games industry. I just see the same waves happening, right? So I think by looking at the music industry, we can predict what's going to happen in the games industry. Maybe, you know. I'm saying it all like it's fact. I don't know, it's just a theory, right? But it's an interesting theory nonetheless. Well, hopefully. So, again, if we go back to 1999, people were basically buying records, a lot of records for sale. And people were also buying a lot of digital music. So Apple and iTunes were starting to take off. And so that puts us in a similar spot to probably around now in the games industry, or maybe a little bit, further back. But what happened with iTunes was that digital basically took over, and digital basically destroyed the format, right? So we saw all the independent record shops close. People don't buy records anymore. Like, you talk to a kid, and if you're watching this and you're under the age of 30, you're probably thinking, what the fuck's a CD, right? But yeah, so then obviously, digital music dominated. People buying digital music, and that's what we're seeing now with games, right? People are buying more and more games digitally. We're seeing places like GameStop struggling, and that's only going to carry on and get worse for those retailers. So the next step is where it gets interesting, right? So what happened after that was streaming kicked in. So while streaming is convenient, which is great, everyone likes convenience, so they can just stream anywhere they want, and it's cheaper, so everyone likes that. They'll actually quite happily put up with the fact it's crappier quality. So if we're going to talk about streaming games, or we're going to talk about latency being shitty, right? Then imagine being able to put your mobile phone down and pick up a controller and play Uncharted, right? Maybe it's a bit laggy, but not enough that you can even notice. 'Cause it's supposed to be really fast, right? Game streaming. So what has streaming and music meant for sales? Well, as you can see, it's rumored that Apple are going to close the biggest record store in the world in 2 years. So Apple have become the biggest record store in the world. Somebody who doesn't even know anything about selling music became the biggest record store in the world. How did that happen? And now they're going to close it because their revenue from sales is collapsing really, really fast. So rumor is they're going to close it in 2 years. And all there will be left is Apple Music and streaming, which is, interesting for sure, So, but what does it mean for musicians? Well, obviously, where does the revenue come from for these people, right? So Spotify, for example, is advertising. Apple Music, it's subscription. But Apple Music is competing with Spotify on price, so they can't possibly charge you what would be considered a reasonable amount. So you end up with a tiny, tiny amount of money being distributed, to all the musicians who are making these songs, right? And ultimately, it results in people making less money. So yeah. How did, if we look at the history of people who are actually aware of this, right, we're going to talk about how this occurred, that streaming took over, because people like AC/DC, Led Zeppelin, and the Beatles, their management or their record labels did not obviously want streaming and digital to become a thing. They were doing really well with physical sales. So when digital happened, these bands did not go digital for a really, really long time. But when digital began to dominate the market, obviously there were no records selling at all anymore, and they had to go into the digital market. And they've done the same with streaming. People resisting streaming for a very long time, and you're seeing what basically everyone is slowly moved into Spotify and things like that now. So it's that same thing. The tidal wave builds up of users, that the other thing becomes redundant. It's just sad that the competing factor for some of these new forms becomes price, right? And what does that mean for the musicians? It means they make less money. So how does it happen? So if we look at indie musicians and them looking for their new revenue streams, because they're not selling as much music, so they want to make more money so that they can basically make a career. AC/DC are quite happy making lots of money. So they're going to look to new places to distribute their music. So when a streaming service comes along and offers it, they'll be like, okay, that seems cool, right? And as more and more people adopt this service, the service becomes more valid. And then more consumers go to the service. And that's how the shift just slowly happens. Over time, it erodes against the previous form. And so indie games, a perfect example, we're all going to do the same thing, right? We're going to see streaming, we're going to step towards it because we're going to get promised an extra, $500, $600 a month. And people will argue that it's on top of our existing revenue. Just like people argue that, the people that download your games from a wares site or whatever, or they torrent your game, right? Those people are, those people wouldn't buy your game anyway, so it doesn't matter, you're not losing any money. But obviously that's not entirely true. If there was no such thing as torrents, I'm sure that people would sell a little bit more games. But that's a totally different argument. I don't know, right? I don't want to talk about that. So obviously, what does this mean as a game developer, right? Well, these things, these changes, these shifts in our industry have changed the way that we design games. So if we look at mobile, once games became free to play, we had to work out how to monetize users. So we did advertising inside the games, which lowers the quality of the experience. We put in-app purchases in, which in some cases people can imagine are exorbitant. People think, oh my God, look how expensive that is, right? And then we add retention mechanics, so we need people to come back over and over again so that they can be in our game to watch adverts, right? So if they don't come back if they finish our game in 2 hours, they're not going to watch many adverts and they're not going to get many opportunities to buy things. So we need them to stay in our games for a long time. So let's look at, so basically the way that people get paid determines how they design the game. So we need to understand how streaming is going to pay the developers to hypothesize how it will change the industry, right? So it stands to reason, if I play Call of Duty for 1 hour, Call of Duty is made by a team of 200 people or 400 people and it costs millions of dollars to make. And Stardew Valley is made by one guy, it took him 4 years to make, and it's, so they're totally different scales of product, right? So it's not fair that if I play Stardew Valley for 1 hour and Call of Duty for 1 hour, that the Stardew Valley guy gets less money than the Call of Duty people, right? They've both given me the same amount of pleasure and enjoyment playing their game, so they both deserve the same cut of the pie, right? I don't think there's any other way to cut it, or then you start basically saying that things are better quality than other things, or something's more worthy than another. So time is the fairest way to do it. And I know that existing streaming services are using that metric on which to pay people. And so let's break that down, right? Let's say a subscription is $10. Platform's going to take 30%. That'd be Steam or whatever. They currently take 30%, so they're going to carry on taking 30%. I play games for 30 hours a month. Therefore, every hour I play, 23 cents is going to go to the developer. So what's cool about it, obviously more people are going to play the game and all that kind of stuff. But, it's a pretty expected model, I think. So what does that mean? Well, it means that games that we can make are going to change. So Journey is considered by many people to be one of the best games ever made, and it only takes 2 hours to play. So that means it will make 46 cents from a user versus the $20 or whatever it cost when it came out. Overwatch, on the other hand, is a multiplayer game that people go back to again and again and again, and it will have a massive lifetime value. I mean, I'm just putting it down at $13.80 there, but in reality, it's probably more. So you can see clearly the business model for Journey isn't really very strong. And this is how we see basically games like some of the premium games you see on mobile have become a lot more niche. Bigger companies can't afford to develop them anymore. So they basically go away and they become hobbyist projects. So I'm not suggesting, well, maybe I am, I don't know. I think I am suggesting that games like Journey will go away. I think they'll have to change. So I think Journey, if it was made for a streaming market, would have to be 20 times longer and would have to have episodic content and updates that make people come back. The social stuff would have to be a lot bigger. So yeah, I mean, essentially, it's a truck outside, it's really annoying. Essentially, I think that streaming is going to be the future of games, right? And yeah, I think it's going to change the kind of games that we as developers can make. So it's really interesting. And so for me, when I look at the future, I think the kind of things I applied to mobile, I have to apply to other platforms as well, which is interesting. I don't know. It's certainly interesting to think about it. We've watched streaming take away from music. We've seen it take away from movies and TV. And so next, it's only going to get worse on console. Obviously, Sony are trying it with the PlayStation 3. and their whole streaming service for, well, PlayStation 4, their streaming service for PlayStation 3 games, which is PlayStation Now. So to me, that's them pre-testing how well this technology works so they can use it and apply it to a bigger scale. So if you imagine yourself in like 5 years, you won't have to, right? Like I just bought a Switch yesterday, and a Scorpio's coming out in like 6 months. So the Scorpio is going to be a faster machine. It's going to cost me like $500, right? And it's really annoying. But imagine if I didn't have to pay that. Just every game that comes out runs at the ultimate spec, and I can play it instantly. I don't have to buy new hardware. That's obviously very appealing from a consumer standpoint, right? So I can see this thing just taking over. The truck is really pissing me off. It won't move. What's it doing? Oh well, it doesn't really matter. But I did have other points and I can't really make them. So one of the other interesting things that I do wonder is that if I release Uncharted on a streaming service, it's obviously going to use lots and lots of processor power to run. If I release like, chess, it's like super simple and low end. I wonder if there'll be some monetizable incentive to like lower your processor bandwidth and things like that to use less of their server systems. But yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting thing to think about the future and prepare for it and just see if things come. Obviously, EA did their downloading service like 2 years ago where you could subscribe and get all the EA games for like, I don't know, $10 a month or something. And then Microsoft just announced a subscription service that isn't streaming as well. It's a download service. But yeah, 100 games from Microsoft for $9.99. The fact these services are appearing, and the fact that if I go back to that previous slide of the people offering stuff, like Amazon, that's Gamefly. I think Amazon's Gamefly. These are all like big current companies, so that are doing streaming. Xfinity, it's EA, right? I mean, it's clear that we're heading in that direction. So, yeah, look out, I guess.